Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Spark Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and today I'm going to be talking with Dr. Kuan Collins, Master Solutions Architect at SAIC, Professor at the University of Maryland, and mentor here at I2C. We had a really interesting conversation about new technologies that are on the cutting edge of what is available to new business owners and entrepreneurs like blockchain, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Let's roll. Hi, Kuan. How are you today?
I'm great, Jack. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Let's see.
Awesome.
I think we're going to go ahead and start with just an introduction from yourself. And I was going to ask if you could tell us a bit about the field that you're interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Kuan Collins. I'm with SAIC. I've been with SAIC for about 18 years now. I've had a variety of different roles, starting with, chief engineer and program manager, director. I've worked in a number of different technical domain areas, such as cyber, cloud, data science, network integration. I moved on to analytics and augmentation and software, sort of on the intelligent data side, so AI, machine learning, that sort of thing. And more recently now, just a broader sort of approach to digital transformation and how we help our government customers sort of plan for that, right? The biggest disconnect I see is the adoption of these technologies and how do we really make them work for these organizations. So that's really been my focus area and what I'll be doing with our customers going forward.
Yeah.
As far as other things, I also am a faculty member at the University of Maryland. I teach in the doctoral program. It's a Doctor of Business Administration program, our evidence-based research methods, as well as our data analytics. And I'm also a mentor currently at the Capital Factory, which is the largest startup accelerator in Austin, Texas. So it's like the center of gravity for all of the startups in Texas.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, it's kind of like what ITC does here in Huntsville.
Exactly. So I'm super excited to be working with you guys and bring my experience, to Huntsville.
Yeah, we're very, very happy to have you as a mentor here. And I know that's a great resource for any entrepreneurs that, come through I2C.
Awesome. Yeah, it's going to be a fun experience. I'm excited about all the growth in Huntsville.
Yeah. So I know that one of your areas of interest is blockchain, and I was wondering if you could kind of give a basic explanation of what that is to our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So blockchain has been really a fascinating technology, and it's fairly simple, right? So it's all software based, and it's effectively a distributed and tamper-proof digital ledger. So you can think of it like a database, and it's a database that contains a lot of information, people, data, transactions. Obviously it's become very popular in the context of cryptocurrency. And so, you can think about, this is digital currency, right? That's going from person to person or organization to organization. And your blockchain effectively securely manages that transaction of where this currency is going and whose hands it's coming into in a very secure and distributed way. So it doesn't belong to any centralized organization or person or individual. There's no centralized management of this ledger. It's very distributed. So it's an easy way to collaborate and trust with the people that you're collaborating, even though you really don't know who is out there, right? So the trust comes from the security and the way that you can authenticate who is engaging in that transaction, if that makes sense. I can walk you through sort of a simple workflow, right? So somebody requests a transaction, and we can use cryptocurrency, but really, it's anything that you want to transact with. It could be, we could protect the identity. So you can think of your identity as something that's being transacted against. Or I know in a lot of supply chain use cases, right? If you wanted to track, say, goods that are being shipped from, one part of the world to the other part of the world, right? There's a lot of organizations and a lot of people that are involved in that transaction. So somebody requests a transaction, and then everybody that's within that network, if you will, has to validate that that transaction and that user that's asking for the transaction is supposed to be there, right? So they get authenticated and validated by everybody that's in the network. And so that's what makes it super secure and what they call tamper-proof, right? So that's where the tamper-proof comes into play, because there's a lot of people that are validating that that person and that requested transaction is authenticated. Mm-hmm. And so once the transaction is verified, basically it creates a record. So it creates a record and it shows that everybody in that network has validated it, and that transaction can take place. And that data associated with the validation of that transaction now gets combined with all the other transactions into what's called a block of data for the ledger. So that's where the term blockchain comes from. And that block gets added to the existing blockchain. And now you have all of the information associated with the thing that you are trying to protect, whether it's the digital currency or your identity or the item that you're tracking in your supply chain. And it's permanent and unalterable. So the transaction is validated, as I mentioned, by all of the parties that are involved in the supply chain, if you will, of the thing that we're trying to protect. And once it is verified, all of the data associated with the verification of that transaction then gets added to create a new block. So that's where the block in blockchain comes from. That block then gets added to the existing blockchain. And now you've got this complete record of everything associated with your supply chain, with your cryptocurrency, if that's the use case that you're using. And it's immutable. So it's permanent and it's unalterable, because there's no one person that can make a change in the data that's contained within that block or in that blockchain. And once it's added to the chain, then the transaction is complete. And that's the end of sort of the workflow for that transaction.
Yeah.
So that's in a nutshell. Hopefully that was simple enough.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. One thing that really kind of stands out to me is your mentioning of how, blockchain is very, very much related to kind of decentralization. And to me, that just kind of very much relates to small businesses and the fact that for smaller businesses, it seems like, would that be a way that, can smaller businesses put that to work in a unique way? Because compared to other methods, that decentralization means that they're going to be able to not get steamrolled by a large corporation that's able to just kind of control everything.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, it's a huge technology that aids in sort of opening up these supply chains, to your point, to smaller businesses and to really anybody that's engaged in, the transaction of whatever it is that we're talking about. So yeah, that is the beauty of it. I think it democratizes, right, the ability to be involved in that industry. And also, I mean, it provides everybody with that sort of single source of truth, right? We're always trying to figure out like who has the best data, who has the real data. And so it's a great way to have that secure, reliable record.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. One thing I wanted to move into from there is, one thing you bring up a lot is how blockchains really often related with cryptocurrency, and in the public eye, they're almost synonymous. And I was going to ask you, what are like some other applications of blockchain that might often be like missed by entrepreneurs who are looking to make the technology work for them and their business? Kind of gets back to the whole idea of like, if it's good for small businesses, what are some ways that small businesses can put that to work for them?
Yeah, great question. So anything again that involves a transaction, right? So you can think about, I mean, it can be something as simple as buying groceries, or you can think of, if we think globally, like a supply chain. You think about truckers, and delivery of those goods from city to city, and all of the places that they have to validate their inventory, validate their identity, validate any of those things, right? All of those pieces of data could be contained in a blockchain associated with that transaction. Any kind of supply chain management use case, voting systems, like I mentioned earlier, identity. So your identity could be something that we protect in a blockchain. And think about how often you have to validate your identity, right? Whether it's at university or at the bank, or when you're voting, or in the hospital when you're going to get checked out. So if we can create a blockchain associated with our identity, right, then that could be a secure way for us to digitally authenticate ourselves, right? If you think about data storage, right, so anything that, again, that we're trying to share with a broader community, we can think about it in the context of a blockchain. I know I worked with a small company in Silicon Valley, and we were talking about, so there's a lot of these cyber hacks, right, or ransomware issues, and ways that organizations have then mitigated those impacts of the attack on their environment. Wouldn't that be great if there was a secure way for us to organizationally share that information? Because typically, like these large organizations, right, their cybersecurity threats and their environments, we don't really talk about that, right? Because it's a very sensitive, sensitive information. It's a sensitive topic in terms of the fact that you organizationally were attacked. But we all are facing those kinds of threats. And it would be amazing to have this central repository where we trust, the people that are involved in it, and we can share that kind of information to say, here's how we dealt with it. Here was the impact, because we can then learn from each other instead of sort of going through the same thing on our own and trying to figure out how to resolve that problem. And that's becoming, a very big problem, as you know, probably with the pipeline, right? The Colonial Pipeline that was impacted, right? And that's only going to become a bigger problem across, all of our organizations.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, I always thought of that type of thing as being something that more so happened to individuals than organizations. And recently, it's just seemed like that's become so much more common. And, I wonder if it is in large part related to like what you were saying about how for organizations, it's really not something you want to talk about, is, these breaches of privacy or just breaches of security. Because, I mean, clearly it's bad for business. People don't want to interact with companies as much if they feel like it's not totally secure.
Right. I mean, trust is a big problem, right? Because you just never know where your threat is going to come from. And so blockchain provides you with that capability to be in a trusted environment digitally, because of that authentication, and that everybody on the network is able to validate what is going on.
Yeah. It's really fascinating that actually, like, the idea of you verifying your identity and having that be something that can be made that secure. And like you said before, like even for people who aren't business owners, like that seems really, it seems like a much greater degree of safety.
Necessary.
Yeah, necessary.
Right.
Be like a much greater degree of safety than what we have right now.
What's really important, though, whenever we apply any of these technologies, is that it has to be thought of, right? So an individual, like entity, say in a supply chain, whether it's a grocery store, or if we're talking about currency, if it's just a bank, like that one organization cannot be the only one in the supply chain that's engaged in blockchain technology, right? For it to work from end to end, everybody needs to be engaged adopting that technology in order for it to be effective. And that's really the case for a lot of our technology, the emerging technologies that we talk about, right? If we're really going to take advantage of the cloud, for instance, right? Everybody needs to be in the cloud in order for all of us to sort of realize the benefit of it, right? If only one person's in the cloud and the other person's not, I mean, think about it even from the perspective of, you sharing a document on Google Drive, right? If somebody is not doing that, right, you can't share it with them unless they are also involved in that system.
Yeah, it's pointless to upload it to the cloud if, they're not going to be able to.
If no one's there to receive it, yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Which honestly makes it kind of a miracle that technologies like that get off the ground, because, getting one person to adopt a new idea is difficult, but getting a whole community of people to adopt an idea, especially with technology,
And
we know it can be like so.
That is an excellent point, Jack, because I think that is the number one thing I think I mentioned in my introduction. That's the biggest disconnect here. Like, blockchain is not new, right? It's been around for a while now. And the issue is adoption, right? And how do we get everybody to collaborate effectively in order to utilize these technologies? And so that's why, that's my focus in life, is to help organizations to figure out how to adopt the technology, because that is the biggest challenge. And, people tend to take it for granted, right? Because you see it working in a context like a Bitcoin, right? And you're like, oh, well, we should be able to use that. Except when you start to apply it to your use case and your problems, now it's a much bigger problem than sort of, what you saw with Bitcoin, which I think is why blockchain has taken off in sort of these niche areas like cryptocurrency, and really hasn't been adopted more broadly, because it's sort of, everybody in the cryptocurrency world is sort of, they've all bought into it, right? They're all in on blockchain. And so it's working because the entire community has like embraced the technology, versus, in any other kind of use case, it's harder because everybody's still scratching their head and wondering, is this the right thing to do?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that cryptocurrency has really been the point that things have taken off the most in terms of gaining widespread, because it's almost got that kind of gold rush effect where people are like, this might be my opportunity to strike it rich, and
exactly,
to varying degrees of success over the years. So one thing that we've really kind of brought up a lot throughout this discussion is just the importance of data. And so I wanted to ask you that, as a mentor, I feel that data is something that all entrepreneurs need to be mindful of, or is it really only important for entrepreneurs who are working in like tech-oriented fields? Like I2C is very tech-oriented, but for entrepreneurs who are working in other things, like say you're going to open up a coffee shop or something like that, is data still important for people doing that sort of thing, or is it really kind of just for the techie companies?
So I love this question. And I will start by saying that data is important to everybody. There is no industry, no company, no domain that cannot benefit from doing a better job of managing their data. I think I mentioned in my introduction too that I'm a professor at the University of Maryland, and I teach data science and data analytics. And one thing that we're pushing in this program is that all of us as citizens of the world have a responsibility to become more data driven in the way that we make our decisions and the way that we form our opinions. And the time, with everything that we've seen in the pandemic and with our politics and all the civil unrest, there's never been a more important time for us to be so focused on data, regardless of who we are and regardless of how old we are. I mean, from school-aged children all the way up to our elderly. And so I think, to your point, though, in terms of entrepreneurs, your ability to maximize and optimize your customer experience with improving your technologies, improving your service, right? All of that is driven by data. Because if you don't collect the data, if you don't manage the data, you're never going to know how to improve upon where you've been, right? So there's always sort of this data collection of where am I at right now? Where do I want to be, and how do I get to the next step, and how do I know that I got there, right? And so all of that is driven by data. And so if you start off with sort of that perspective, especially for new entrepreneurs, that's huge because then, it sort of becomes a no-brainer. You know what I mean? That you've already started collecting this data and you can work with that data and build upon it. It's a lot harder if you sort of force it after the fact, right? So you start to wonder, well, I didn't quite collect all the right pieces of data up front. So now I've got to sort of back into it. And then now you've got a data mismatching problem because, if you're forcing data sort of retrospectively, are you actually correlating the right data and making the right decision? So paying attention to that up front and understanding sort of what you want, what is the outcome that you want from collecting all of this data is really important up front.
This is a kind of a random example, but I just happened to remember this out of nowhere that people have actually been using data for longer than I would have guessed, because back when I was young, in restaurants, they'd have those little cards that they'd put in like the napkin holder on the table or something, and they'd have the little
exactly,
and you'd fill it out about, how was the service, how was the food, and they'd just be collecting information about it so that they could, better tailor that experience to you. I guess another way is you go to a fast food restaurant, you go through Wendy's, and there at the bottom of your receipt is a little call this number and answer these questions on a survey, and we'll give you a free sandwich.
Well, and now with things like, Yelp or TripAdvisor, I mean, how often, like if you're in a new place, you go onto Yelp and you're like, what's the best Mexican restaurant in town?
Yeah.
And all of that's driven by restaurants collecting that information. And now you've got, 500 customers that have said that you're, excellent at, whatever it is that you're doing. And so, yeah, it's a huge part of small businesses, especially these days, to leverage all of the data platforms that are available, to improve the service that you're providing the community.
Yeah, that's actually not even an angle that I had considered yet, was the fact that as a business owner, you don't necessarily have to be the one collecting the data. You can use other community-driven efforts to collect data. To some extent, it's really about knowing the sources that you can go to find that data.
Mm-hmm. And make it also part of your practice, right? It's one thing to say, yeah, I'm paying attention to social media, but what are you doing with the data that you're collecting from social media? How is it part of your culture, right? To respond to that, to incorporate that into the decisions that you're making. So that's another piece of it. It's not just the collecting, but then it's the what are you doing with it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That almost reminds me of there's a restaurant, Five Guys,
mm-hmm.
take little snippets from reviews and they post them on the walls all around.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's kind of just like, one little way that they're just taking what really at the end of the day is data and utilizing that almost in a way of marketing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Focusing on these food-oriented examples because it's something that's very much like a kind of a ubiquitous human experience. Like everybody's gone to restaurants and seen these little things.
Absolutely. And I don't know anybody that doesn't use social media nowadays to find where they're going to eat. Right?
Yeah. I'll like Google restaurants near me, even though I know every restaurant in a 25-mile radius. I'm just like, I just got to see the list or else I'm not going to be able to pick somewhere.
And you might miss something, right? Like there might be something new that you haven't checked out yet. So, thank God for Google. I don't know what.
Yeah, definitely. And then from there, another area of expertise that you have is on artificial intelligence solutions. And so what I wanted to ask you is, how long do you think it's going to be before AI driven solutions are available to owners of smaller startup companies? And then do AI and machine learning solutions kind of present a significant advantage to smaller companies? Or does a company really need to already be above kind of a certain size threshold in order to make use of those more complex data-oriented approaches?
So great question, and a great follow-up to our discussion about data in general. Because in order for AI to be useful, it does require a lot of data typically, right? So I love the example of, if you're teaching a baby to recognize a dog, right? You can just show them a couple of pictures. You can point to a dog and say dog. And eventually, pretty quickly, the baby's going to be like, that's a dog. Mm-hmm. For AI to recognize that that's a dog, you need to show that algorithm and train that algorithm across millions of photographs and different size dogs with different types of ears, different colored fur, for it to be fairly accurate, because you want it to be like close to something like 90%, right? That's a dog. But it's very difficult, right? And this is why sort of, autonomous vehicles are still having problems, because there's still a lot of error, right? That you can't train on absolutely everything, right? And you're always going to have some margin of error. And how much margin of error are you willing to accept in that AI, depending on the decision that you're trying to make?
Yeah.
So, in the case of like retail, so whenever we're on Facebook, for instance, right, it is using AI based on our clicks, based on the things that we're reading. It's tailoring all of the advertising and the things that we're seeing based on what it's seeing that we're looking at. So we have a pretty, I think, high tolerance for error there, because most of the time you're either ignoring it or you're like, oh, that's interesting because that was something that I was looking at. Yeah. Or if Google will push some ads to you or notifications or what have you based on the things that you're searching for. And again, you've got a pretty high tolerance for error there. Now, in the case of medical diagnoses, right, you want a pretty high confidence, right, that AI is going to tell you exactly what you have, or you want your doctor to validate, what you're seeing. And that's an instance where AI is not ready. Right? AI is not ready to make those kinds of very critical decisions. Now, going back to your question about size of business, I would say that there's really no entry level, threshold that's required in order to utilize AI. And especially now with all the technologies that are inherent in the cloud, so if any business is just, engaged in Amazon or Azure or Google or any of the cloud service providers, there's a lot of AI that is inherent in the services that the cloud provides. And it would be beneficial, just like in our data discussion, for a company to understand all of those inherent services and open source AI capabilities that they can leverage to help them improve their business. And it can be similar to what we talked about with data in terms of customer experience, in terms of, the quality of the delivery of their services, any kind of lag time in their workflows, right? Where can they optimize the way that they're doing their business, right? And drive efficiencies. In cybersecurity, certainly, right? So everybody has a cybersecurity issue. So identifying where there's anomalies on your network, where there could be insider threat problems, external threat problems, all of those kinds of things, AI can be very helpful. But it does require our previous discussion that you have to be collecting the data and you have to be collecting it appropriately and managing it appropriately in order for the AI to give you the kind of answer that you can trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that reminds me of, I was reading, it was a secondary source about an article, but what they were talking about was apparently there was a company in Japan that it was like, I guess it was a bakery, and they had all these different kinds of, all these different types of breads and like baked goods. And it's kind of like a self-serve thing where you'd go and you'd get your baked goods and then you'd bring them up to the front. And the issue that they were noticing is that they were losing a lot of business because it would take a long time for workers to look at all the different like buns that people were picking out and, go through and look up, here's the price for this one and here's the price for this one. And so what they ended up doing was, I think it was that they paid a programmer and they worked with him for, I think it was a long time, but basically he created a program that could just use a camera and look at all the buns that they would set on the counter, and it would tally up the price on its own. And that would, basically it would do it in, a tenth of the time that the worker could, and it would leave the worker able to just like make small talk or something while this robot, this AI kind of did its work. But what was really impressive about it was apparently there were, I can't remember the exact way that it happened, but somebody realized that that same program could also be taught to look at cells from a human body and identify cancer cells. Because, I guess it was something about how there were similar fundamentals between recognizing different loaves of bread and telling those apart, and telling, if one cell is cancerous and another one's not. And so it's just kind of like showing how things can really go from like this very, small example to like very serious, very much like low tolerance of error example. And like AI is able to do kind of everything in between. Yeah, just what you were talking about made me think of that. And I think it's a really interesting example of.
It is fascinating. I mean, there's so many areas, just like what we were saying with data, where AI is going to, be the same level of disruption that electricity was, when electricity was first discovered. Because especially when we crack the code on getting to a high reliability, a high level of confidence in the outcome of the AI. I mean, think about just from a traffic perspective, if we're all in autonomous vehicles, right? The way that traffic can flow more efficiently, we can just, that alone will revolutionize the way we travel, right? The way that we commute, the way that we just move from place to place. And, that goes for all kinds of transportation. To your point, experiences in grocery stores. I mean, they already have like the Amazon grocery store, right? Where you basically walk in, you purchase your stuff, you walk out, and it's charged to your account, and it's all based on AI, right? No interaction with a cashier or with scanning your goods, because it's all been scanned already.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting over the next 5 to 10 years to see how this technology evolves, and how we as organizations and as human beings, figure out and navigate how to utilize the technology.
Yeah, it definitely gets back to that principle of like, over the next few years, just in the foreseeable future in general, like the real challenge is going to be getting not just individuals, but communities to accept these new, like very new technologies that are a little scary to people, I think, in a lot of cases. The thought of walking into a grocery store, grabbing stuff and walking out without paying anyone is like, oh, that gives me some anxiety. But yeah, it's pretty amazing what people are figuring out, ways that you can teach a computer to solve problems that, people have been trying to solve in businesses for the last, 200 years probably. And yeah, it's really exciting to see where everything's going to go. And I've really enjoyed having this opportunity to sit down and learn from you. It's always great to hear from somebody who's like very clearly super knowledgeable in their field. And it's
been great talking to you too, Jack. And I'm so excited to be joining the I2C. I really think that organizations like I2C are so important to keep promoting these kinds of technologies, and to figure out like how we can better adopt them across the community.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, especially with very concentrated tech-oriented kind of focal points like I2C, it really is a great background for, creating a community that's going to be able to accept these new technologies. And we're very, very happy to have you here as a mentor, able to let your expertise, work some of its magic here in our community too.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to Kuan for the conversation. I hope that everyone here at the I2C was able to learn a little bit more about the technological solutions that are available to entrepreneurs today. We're really excited to have Dr. Collins here at the I2C as a mentor, as we all strive to have the technological flexibility to adapt in an ever-changing world of business. I hope that you've all enjoyed listening today and that you'll be on the lookout for the next guest on the Spark Spotlight podcast. In the meantime, be sure to follow us on all of our socials, at UAH I2C on Instagram and Twitter, and UAH Invention to Innovation Center on Facebook. Onward and upward.